Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Phillips. We're continuing our series of lectures for one of the two options you have for that final paper for the semester. One is on the history of slavery. This is on how the United States ended up fighting a civil war and the long road to that event. That on one level is, of course, tragic. Wars are tragic. But on the other hand, really is the only means by which slavery would have ever ended. And of course, slavery is a monstrosity and a tragedy as well. This is the third lecture in the series. And I want to reiterate some things I said at the end of the last lecture. I want to note that if we can come to the map here and show the map, this is a map of the Mexican-American War. Texas here, see in this shade of color, the Texas boundary is here. All this area here was at one point claimed by Texas, and some of it will be added to the modern state of Texas. So Texas doesn't have the shape it does today. This is going to be territory taken by the United States and annexed. If you look at the map, though, look how far the United States actually penetrates into Mexico. It absorbs most of it. This far south. Theoretically, the United States could have annexed all of Mexico. Mexico would be part of the U.S. They were in Mexico City, the capital. The U.S. had an overwhelming victory. So what happens and why does the United States give back that territory? Because the U.S. is all about acquiring land at this point. And there were Southerners who thought we could turn this into plantation land. As I said, there were Southerners who wanted to annex Cuba and make that plantation land to various parts of Latin America. But we have a case where racism collides with the lust for new territory. By September 1847, American troops took Mexico City. Mexican resistance came to an end. They occupy now 2/3 of Mexico. And most supporters of the war were perfectly okay with adding to the United States the lands that incorporate modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, and California, along with Utah, Colorado, etc. Those were all part of Mexico at one point. The land south of that line is another matter. Millions of Mexicans live south of the Rio Grande and between the Rio Grande and Mexico City. To annex within its territory all that land, the United States would have to accept within its borders legions of people that white people thought of as innately inferior and as incapable of participating in free institutions. Along with Native Americans and African Americans, Anglos would also have to deal with the large population of people of both European and indigenous heritage. What they called in those days, in a horrible phrase, mongrels, racial mongrels. What Mexicans refer to as mestizos, people of mixed race. So there were people in Congress who called for annexing all of Mexico, but there was a real issue. What would their status be? One Democrat, William Wick of Indiana, said, quote, "I don't want any mixed races in the Union, nor men of any color except white, unless they be slaves. Certainly not as voters or legislators." So this is the context for the treaty that's signed at the end of the war. Special Envoy Nicholas Trist negotiates with the Mexican government. This is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848. Mexico surrenders its northern provinces of California and what we call New Mexico today. That includes Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado. They acquire, the U.S. Draws the boundary at the Rio Grande and west. In return, the United States pays Mexico $15 million and sets aside $2 million for any individual claims any Mexican citizens have against the United States because of damages to property during the war, loss of land, etc. Now, the opponents of the war are going to be in the minority, but their objections are going to be really intense. I referred to this last time. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an opponent of the war, as were other New England writers who were called the Transcendentalists. He realized that the annexation of the new territories would only make the debate over slavery much more intense. He said, quote, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." Polk was not happy with the treaty. He wanted more land. He thought Trist gave up, but he decided under pressure to go ahead and sign it and to forward it to the Congress, and the Congress approves it. In fact, this war and the debate over the status of slavery in those lands will come to poison the American political system. It's going to deepen the rifts between the regions. Southerners had hoped the new territories would become a slave empire. You know, if you remember the Missouri Compromise line, that they took the southern boundary of Missouri in 1820, they drew the line west, and now that line extends all the way to the Pacific. They just assumed everything south of that line would be territory that would become new slave states. That's not how it turned out. And you're going to, and they want this because they see all that land as unexhausted soil, good soil with nutrients in there. Again, cotton drains nutrients from the soil. They thought this will guarantee the survival of slavery forever. That is not what happened. In fact, the Mexican-American War helps hasten the Civil War and doom slavery. Now, we're going to talk about a man named David Wilmot, who makes a rather controversial proposal about what to do with the Mexican territories. Wilmot is a Pennsylvania, that's not him, that's a Pennsylvania Democrat. He offers an amendment to the Army Appropriations Bill after the war is over. In August 1840, or this is actually during the war, during the Mexican-American War, August 1846. In that amendment to the Army Appropriations Bill, that's where they set aside the money for the U.S. military. His amendment says, quote, that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in any territory taken from Mexico. Now, by this time, the House is dominated by Northerners. I have to address something here. There is a right-wing attempt today to deflect attention from the racial politics of the present, to point out something obvious, that for much of its history, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, it was the party of the Klan, it was the party of lynching. That's a large part of history, but parties change. They would argue that, well, it's the Democrats who always supported slavery. Actually, what mattered on both the issue of slavery and then the issue of civil rights in the 20th century. Northerners tended to be on one side and Southerners tended to be on the other side, regardless of party. So Southern Whigs would defend slavery. Southern Democrats would defend slavery. Northern Democrats would often attack slavery. Northern Whigs would support or attack slavery. In the Civil Rights era, Northern Democrats and Republicans supported civil rights. Southern Democrats and Republicans didn't. So that if you hear that argument, it's a half-truth. Okay? And you can't judge parties by how they were in the 1850s and 1860s, because all institutions changed. The United States was a slave republic. It is no longer a slave republic. Now, so the Northern Democrats are going to join with Northern Whigs when Wilmot makes that proposal that any new territory taken from Mexico will be free territory. They support it. They vote for it. And they pass that proviso. It goes to the Senate, And there, the South still exercises considerable power. The free states and slave states are still evenly balanced, and there are some senators from the North who still support, they're willing to sympathize with the South and back the South. There, the proviso is killed. That debate foreshadows the future of American politics, where region is everything. I need to add something here. I've said this before about the motives of white people who oppose slavery. Black people opposed it on moral grounds, on the grounds of how it affected them and their families, their loved ones. White people tended to think of themselves. It's only in the 1850s that we began to have a sustained moral critique of slavery. Wilmot is not an abolitionist. He only wants to keep enslaved people out of the Mexican territories so he can keep all black people out of those territories. If you have slavery, you have black people. That's the politics of the time. He said, quote, "I would preserve for white free labor a fair country." And by free labor, he means labor where the workers are free to choose who they work for, when they quit, and so on. I would preserve for white free labor a fair country where the sons of toil, my own race and color, can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. Wilmot's a racist. And he's also wanting to stop the spread of slavery. A lot of times students have trouble understanding how those two things can exist simultaneously. They do. The Wilmot Proviso aims not at destroying slavery in the South at all. It just wants to confine slavery to the South. Without the proviso, the status of slavery in the new territories is unresolved. Because when they actually drew the Missouri Compromise line, it only really went to the western border of Arkansas and into Oklahoma, modern-day Oklahoma. So they have to, there's a debate. Does that line extend to the Pacific? Should that happen, by the way, then slavery would automatically be abolished in the future states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Nevada, and Northern California. However, California would have to be divided. You would have new slave states in Southern California and the modern-day states of Arizona and New Mexico. Remember, where they drew the line actually turned out to be a big disadvantage to the South, because people in the 1820s, when they drew the Missouri Compromise line, thought all that land was mostly desert. And they didn't realize how productive agriculturally it'd be. So, trying to figure out, what are we going to do with all this new land we've seized from Mexico? Is it going to be slave? Is it going to be free? How is it going to be governed? Men like Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan are going to propose a compromise solution that he calls popular sovereignty. This is an idea that sounds good on the surface. Popular sovereignty is you let the people decide. And so his proposal is that the people in the different territories, when they, write their territorial constitution, and then when they reach a big enough population, they can ask the Congress to be admitted as a state, they decide the status of slavery for themselves. Of course, black people have no voice in this. African Americans have no voice. The enslaved have no voice in this. So here's the problem. This solution has one ambiguity that will prove fatal. It doesn't specify when that decision is going to be made. Most Northerners are certain it would happen once a territory, because there's a process. The U.S. acquires land, it gets a certain population, it organizes, meaning it organizes a local government. The U.S. Congress recognizes that territorial government, and then later on, it reaches a certain population, applies for statehood, it submits a constitution to the Congress, which has to approve it. The Northerners are going to assume that the status of slavery would be determined when a territory is legally organized, while most Southerners are going to say, no, not until the state constitution is written. They hope this will draw out the process long enough to allow slavery to take root. You know, there's not a determination on legality of slavery. Slave owner enslavers move in, they establish themselves, they start growing crops, and that brings other enslavers in, and then eventually you have a critical mass, and it becomes so important to the economy that no one's going to oppose it. That's their idea. And we're going to see this will have this ambiguity in the idea of popular sovereignty is going to have deadly consequences when Kansas is organized. It tries to organize as a state. It tries to enter the Union as a state. Now, this will come to a head in 1850. Both major political parties at the time, and I'll write the name of the party, the two parties. Again, this is spelled with the H, Whigs, named after a British party. Again, the Whigs in England, that was a political party in England, were the party that believed the parliament should have more power than the king. So it's sort of an opposition to the monarchy in a way. The Whigs in America form when a Democratic president, Andrew Jackson, is seen as someone with dictatorial tendencies who sees himself as a king. So they're trolling him by naming themselves that. Of course, the other party and the dominant party of this era are the Democrats. Both the Whigs and the Democrats have support in the North and the South. Both have members who are pro-slavery, anti-slavery, and some people who say let's keep slavery where it is, let's not let it expand. There is now a small number that begins to grow of people who actually favor abolition. But they're by no means a majority, not close to it. So even though slavery is the most important issue of the day, presidential candidates try to ignore it. And in fact, other politicians often try to ignore it. They try to talk about anything else other than slavery. In fact, there'll be a political party in the 1850s that officially is called the American Party. It more commonly becomes known as the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothings, they originate as a series of lodges, secret clubs. And one theory as how they got that name was they're not supposed to reveal any secrets. And if someone asks a member of the Know Nothings, what did you guys talk about? What are you after? You're supposed to say, I know nothing. Another theory is it's simply a newspaper editor was sarcastic and he says they don't know anything. They're dunces. That was a party formed against immigration. They were against the Irish immigration, against German immigration. They were really against Catholic immigration. They're worried about that. And it was about basically, let's build a wall, not literally, but metaphorically around the United States. That was a way to not talk about slavery. Let's talk about immigrants instead. That's certainly going to be true of the Whigs and the Democrats in the time. The Whigs, every single election, they tend to vote or they tend to nominate for president generals with war records. So they can talk about what a hero he was in the last war. So they continue that tradition in 1848. They nominate one of the big heroes from the Mexican-American War, General Zachary Taylor, who was also a major slave owner. So they're hoping they can just keep it out of mind. But something happens that makes their lives very complicated and the lives of the country very complicated. That is, we have an event happen. Hold on. In 1849, at a place called Sutter's Mill, California, they discovered gold. The gold rush. That's why the San Francisco 49ers football team is called the 49ers, because a big gold rush happened. People are aware there's gold there, And about 100,000 gold seekers migrate to California in 1849, 1 year after it officially becomes American territory. 1 year they hit the threshold for becoming a state. And then the question is the Missouri Compromise line still in effect? Because if it is, let's look at the southern boundary of Missouri. It'd go across here, and you'd have a chunk of Southern California that would be in territory that's supposed to automatically be slave territory, and then a chunk of it that would have to be free territory. Well, here's the problem. The people actually living in California don't want legalized slavery. And by the way, you also have at the same time a little bit of complexity. If we go to Utah, there are a group of people called Mormons, the Church of Mormon, who they had originated in the Midwest, but they were persecuted because of their belief in polygamy, and because Joseph Smith, the prophet who founded the Mormon faith, basically took over a local government, and people thought he was ruling as a dictator, and they began killing Mormons, and they flee to Utah, and they established Salt Lake City, and the population is big enough that they're eligible for statehood too. And the Mormons believe in the something I talk about in the lectures on slavery. They believe that black people are under a biblical curse, the curse of Ham, that they've been punished by God because their ancestor, Ham, one of the sons of Noah, and they're destined to be servants unto servants. And so the Mormons are friendly to slavery, but they're living in territory north of the Missouri Compromise line. Well, this is going to be really complicated. Polk, James K. Polk, who is the president who pushed for the acquisition of all this territory, the man who initiated the Mexican-American War, wants to extend the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific. He's a Democrat. The Whigs control the Congress. They defy him. They, it's the U.S. House. The House Whigs do. They again approve the Wilmot Proviso. They vote to approve California as a free state. They call for abolishing the slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings in Washington, D.C. The Senate, however, these proposals get voted down. Fistfights break out in Congress, and members of Congress began carrying weapons into the House chamber and the Senate. They get into fights. They threaten each other's lives, and they challenge each other to duels. There's actually bloodshed on the floor of Congress. I mean, people are bloodied in fights. And Southern congressmen threatened to leave the Union, to secede, if any of these bills pass in the Senate. The Democratic-controlled Senate crushes all those proposals. Now, Democrats are going to expect President Zachary Taylor to back them, but they're shocked that, like Andrew Jackson, he's a nationalist first and a Southerner second. So Taylor proposes admitting both California and the territory of New Mexico as free states, because most of the people living there, that's how they view the issue. October 1849, Californians hold a constitutional convention. They draw up a free state charter. Their constitution is calling for it to be a free territory, and they apply for admission. At that point, the Union, before California admission, the Senate is 15 free states, 15 slave states. But the admission of California will tip the balance. Now, just like free states control the House, now they'll control the Senate. and they're going to lose veto power in the legislature, in the Senate. Southerners are. So they again threaten civil war. And they want the U.S. government to force California to be a slave state. They're not really worried about democracy for anyone. So Henry Clay, who 3 decades earlier had forged the Missouri Compromise, is still there. He's in the U.S. Senate representing Kentucky. He's 72 years old. And he tries to put together a package just like he did with Missouri to get California admitted to the Union and to resolve the issue of slavery in these territories. So he sends 8 proposals to the Senate, proposed legislation. The first 6 are grouped in pairs. And sort of like with the Missouri Compromise, with each pair of proposals, he tries to give one thing to the South, one thing to the North. So the first 2 proposals would admit California as a free state, but would organize the territory of New Mexico with no restrictions on slavery. Second pair of proposals is going to deal with Texas. If we could go back to the map here, the older map. Here we go. So let's go here. Texas claims all this territory. It goes to southern Colorado. Instead, Clay is going to propose that we do this. We draw the modern Texas. That's the land Texas gets. That's the proposal. Also, in return for that, Texas not getting land that it wanted in modern day New Mexico and Colorado, Clay's plan says, you know what? We're going to pay off all the debts that the Republic of Texas ran up before it became a state in the United States. Texas Republic had to borrow money constantly. The U.S. government will pay that off. So you don't get all the land you're claiming, Texas, but we're going to relieve you of your debt. The third pair of proposals would abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but would guarantee the right to own slaves in D.C. unless both Virginia and Maryland, which surround D.C., both abolish slavery, which is unlikely to happen. And then the last 2 proposals are what ends up being a fatal part of the compromise in terms of the fate of slavery, and is abominable. One affirms that the Congress, both of these are going to be gifts to the South. The first proposal is that Congress has no right to regulate the interstate slave trade, meaning the trade of slaves from one state to another. The second one, and this is the one that really is going to be explosive, it will actually lead to the death of slavery. A strong federal fugitive slave act, something the southern states have wanted for a long time. There's a provision in the Constitution that makes the federal government responsible for tracking down, capturing, and returning escaped enslaved human beings. This is the first time there's actually a law with teeth in it. And it's going to appoint federal marshals whose job it is to track human beings who have escaped bondage wherever they can find them, and gives the power of these marshals to deputize people, even against their will, to help in the capture. And the Southerners wanted that, and there's hardly anything in the Compromise of 1850 that's going to end up inciting more anti-slavery sentiment in the North than that proposal. So he tries to, he has trouble getting support for any of these proposals. He backtracks. He tries to get them all passed in one package. They won't go through. There's too much opposition to each provision. And then he basically leaves Washington for a summer vacation. He's depressed. He thinks the Union's doomed. And he thinks the legislation is doomed. So another politician with a lot of ambition, who dreams and dreams and dreams one day of being president, Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, picks up the mantle from Clay. And Douglas is younger, has more energy, returns to the original strategy. That's do these bills one at a time. And he's able to persuade enough senators for each individual proposal, 8 of them, that each one gets passed separately. As collectively, it's known as Compromise of 1850. But some people will oppose, paying Texas debt. Others will oppose, the provisions on the slave trade, banning the slave trade in D.C. But he's able to get just enough senators for each plan to get each one through. One by one, they pass, and the Compromise of 1850 becomes a reality. California becomes a state. Territories are organized in New Mexico and Arizona, and their status, there's no abolition of slavery in those territories as territories yet. They haven't entered the Union yet as states. They won't until much later. And we seem to, the political leadership said, well, we dodged a bullet there because we got really close to the Civil War. In fact, we hastened the arrival of the Civil War in 1861, and the biggest issue will be this particular piece of legislation, that Fugitive Slave Act. Northern resistance to that and the reaction to the human tragedies that occur because of that law, which include African Americans who had spent their whole lives as free people being kidnapped and dragged to the South and enslaved because of this law, will really increase the momentum for basically abolition, the abolitionist politics, and also for a stronger northern resistance to granting concessions to southern slave owners. So we'll talk about that next time.